Yeah, as Pastor said, when y'all meet to talk about budget stuff, we're one of the groups that y'all support and partner with. So I say a thank you from that. And so even today, I get to share as your missionary. And so oftentimes when I grew up, missionaries came from the other part of the world and showed their pictures and told their stories, and it was really cool. But that was a long way off and didn't mean much. I'm the missionary down the street, and our team is the missionary down the street. And yeah, we're just trying to represent Jesus at UT and every space God gives us access to. So thank you. You're a part of that. Everything that comes from that is just as much your story as it is ours, as in our partnership. So thank you so much. We're just going to jump in. The older I get, which is I'm in my world, I'm really old because I hang out with college students all the time. In the big picture, I'm somewhere in the middle. I've been living for an hour or two. I got people way ahead of me that have been alive 9 or 10 hours, and they have a lot to teach me, and I humbly listen. And then there's some way behind. But one thing I've learned is if I try to categorize people, one thing I've kind of categorized people is there's those who follow the rules, and they're all for it. They're like, yes, rules. We need them. Give me more rules. It just helps me make decisions. I don't have to make as many if you just tell me what the rules are. And then there's those who don't follow the rules, who are just like, who are you to tell me what the rules are? That's it. No, I'm not. And just because you told me, I'm not going to do it. Some of us are bent that way. And then there's people like me who's like, some of your rules are stupid and some are good, and I'm going to get to pick which ones are stupid I'm not going to follow, and which ones are good and I'll follow. That's the way I am. I land in there somewhere. So that's the three types of people. Texas, our wonderful state, is full of some stupid rules. I'm not about to tell you my opinion. I'm going to tell you some real dumb ones. First one, horses being ridden after dark must have taillights. Real law in this state. So this week, when you're out riding and the sun sets earlier now, so be careful. Just throw some taillights on your horse, you'll be fine. Do you know windshield wipers are required in the state of Texas on all vehicles, on all cars? You have to pass inspection, you have to have windshield wipers. You know what's not required? A windshield. You don't have to have a windshield on a car, but you have to have wipers. In this great city we live in, it is illegal to conceal wire cutters. Or open carry, so you can carry them in your hand all you want, but you just can't carry them in your pocket. So it's illegal. You can get fined $500 for concealing wire cutters in your pocket. Those are all stupid laws. Sorry, if you wrote them or if they benefit you, if you're the guy with the land protected by barbed wire fence, I'm really sorry. I know they're there for you, but those are dumb laws. And I think we can kind of all agree on that. And the world we live in, the more pluralistic it becomes, the more rules are going to feel, the more our laws are going to begin to feel more subjectively stupid or good or bad. But the subjectivity of it is continually going to grow and grow and grow around us. And so when Paul is speaking in this passage that we're going to read here in a second, it's important to remember that Paul is working in kind of the same categories. The culture of Rome, the church at Rome has some of the same categories that even we identify. There's some that are rule followers. Just tell me what to do, I'll do it. I'm all in. Some rule breakers. You want me to do what? Nope. Just because you said so. That's enough motivation for me to break the rules. Or there's some that kind of decide on their own what's good, what's bad, and I'm going to follow the good ones with all my heart. I'm going to push back on the bad ones. We live in the middle lands. That's me. That's where I've spent most of my life. So as we read that, this is what's been happening for a long time. We're not the first group of Christians to try to parse and understand Paul's words to the church here. We won't be the last. There have been all kinds of understandings and takes on it, some very humorous. The most humorous one is that there's one modern theologian who actually says this is irony, and Paul has his fingers crossed behind his back as he's writing it. He doesn't really mean exactly what he's saying. He means the opposite. Blows my mind how someone gets to that conclusion, but they exist. They're all out there. We won't be the first ones to try to understand it. We won't be the last. But the reality is the scripture is clear. What Paul writes here is very clear, and it's for the body of believers. It is for those who believe in a resurrected Messiah and a restoration to a creator that we rebelled against. And the problem and the tension that exists in the passage is not because the church is difficult. It's because culture around us has set a standard and a virtue that sometimes is contradictory to the Word of God. And we have to live in that tension. So as we read, keep that in mind, that what we're dealing with is the perfect Word of God and an imperfect world with imperfect people. All right? So open up to Romans chapter 13. We're going to read verses 1 through 8. Paul writes, "Let everyone submit to the governing authorities, since there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are instituted by God. So then, the one who resists the authority is opposing God's command, and those who oppose it will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you want to be unafraid of the one in authority? Do what is good, and you will have its approval. For it is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, because it does not carry the sword for no reason. For it is God's servant and avenger that brings wrath on the one who does wrong. Therefore you must submit, not only because of the wrath, but also because of your conscience. And for this reason you pay taxes, since the authorities of God's servants continually attending to these tasks. Pay your obligations to everyone, taxes to those you owe taxes, tolls to those you owe tolls, respect to those you owe respect, and honor to those you owe honor. Do not owe anyone anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another is fulfilled in the law." Pray with me. Father, open our hearts, not to parsing a culture or parsing an algorithm or news. Open our hearts to fully understand your perfect word. And where correction is needed, God, may we humbly receive. Where encouragement is needed, God, may your Spirit speak loudly and boldly in a filling way. But God, I pray today that we walk out encouraged by who you are in all things. In a world that seeks division, in a world that feels like even leaders are the ones agitating, God, may we walk out knowing your peace and your hand over us. It's in your name. Amen. So as we read those, I bet kind of all three kinds of people. If you're the rule follower, you read that passage, you're like, that's right. Got it. Let's go. And you're ready. Like, I don't need a sermon. I got to figure it out. Let's run. If you're the rule breaker, you're like, never. I'm not doing that. No. Or if you're somewhere in the middle like me, it depends. Let's wait and see what happens here, right? And we're not the only ones. I think Paul's audience, the church in Rome, is partly Romans, Gentiles, partly Jews that had moved into Rome as Israel was kind of brought into the Roman diaspora. So they're moving. They can migrate into that space for business, for military, for whatever reason they want, but they're moving in. So the church there in Rome has many types of cultures sitting in the room, many opinions, many personalities, and many background understanding of what the role of government and rule and authority is, right? For the Jewish believers in the room, they have this Old Testament background of like the life in exile in Babylon, where God commands them to go in and live peacefully among the people for its benefit, and in that God will bless them. Or some are coming in with a more nationalistic view where their understanding has more to do with my obedience to Rome is by default betrayal to Jesus. And the two can't come together. So if that's their mindset, and then Paul here says, you must submit yourself, there's tension right away. And for the Roman believers, there's a big, especially these are people who've given their life to Christ, trusted Jesus. There's a massive dissatisfaction with Nero, the Caesar in Rome at the time. Now, in this moment, Nero has not really gone down the road of devastation, especially over Christians, that he will. Soon after this letter, just a few years after this letter, there will be, Nero will actually draw Christians in and imprison them, behead them, put their heads on stakes, and light them on fire to light his gardens. So a terrible day for Christians is coming at the hand of the Roman government. They're not in it yet, but they're there. But there's still a great dissatisfaction, ethically, morally. Roman historians talk about the horrendous life ethically that Nero lived in private. And it was very known what he did behind closed doors and very documented in Roman history. So there's a great dissatisfaction. So Paul is calling all of these believers to surrender to these authorities. And I think there's this kind of But all of this passage happens in a larger conversation that y'all have been studying about how do we live as Christians, as followers of Christ, as those who have stepped under the lordship of Jesus. How do we live with those around us that don't live under that lordship of Jesus? How do we live with those outside this room? And you've been studying that, you've got a little more. So this conversation happens inside this larger one. And so that's what we want to read it in, that understanding, is how do we as Christians get along with and live life with those outside the room. I think my one request would be this, is before we try to filter our own questions through this passage and understand this modern relationship between governing authorities and the Church of Jesus, can we pause and just walk through the passage at what it says? And then let's filter our questions through, right? Because you read that and there's if you're like me, 7 or 8 questions come up every time I read these 8 verses. And that's just when I stop paying attention to the questions. That's like verse 3, right? Like there's already a whole lot. Now there's more that I've kind of turned off. So we're just going to walk through a verse at a time and unpack it, and I'll hand it back to you, and we'll go live life before Jesus outside these walls. So verse 1, let everyone submit to the governing authorities, since there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are instituted by God. Now, I need to understand that first word, everyone, is an imperative for Paul. That means there are no exclusions. Every one of us. There's no way out of this. So rule followers, you win. You got this one, all right? We all have to play along on this one. But most of our hearts, our minds, and our eyes are drawn to those words in that first line that says we must surrender to authority. And I just want to say this. If that is the place we send our attention in reading this passage, we are missing Paul's most valuable and greatest emphasis in this passage. We're missing it. Paul says that, yes, and I understand the attention we want to go straight there, but that is not where Paul starts. Paul says, yes, that is happening, but it's happening why? Because there is no authority except from God. Paul is not first calling us to surrender our lives to governing authorities. The primary call Paul is calling believers here to is to surrender themselves to the sovereignty of God. The sovereignty of God. And what Paul is saying is God doesn't merely meddle in government and politics and in authorities over lands and nations and peoples. He doesn't just meddle. He doesn't like, oh, there's a beehive, I'll kick it and see what happens. What Paul is saying is God is actually orchestrating governments throughout all history. The same way a maestro over an orchestra would wave his baton over the woodwinds and they would play something. He'd go to the other side to the string section and we'd get a whole nother level of music. We'd go to the back and the brass would join in and he'd wave his baton over everyone and the entire masterpiece would come out. That is God's involvement in the way our governments and our authorities are orchestrated both in this world and all through history. For me, it reminds me of the imagery of the first book of the Chronicles of Narnia as a young professor, the professor from Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe as a child, and he's made his way into Narnia, or what is being Narnia, and he's in this gray, flat land, and he hears a noise and a music coming from a ways off, but he can't see kind of the focus, the epicenter of it. But there's things moving and shaking and around, and there's a light and a joy that is distant. And he just pays his attention to it, and as it comes at him, he sees this lion, and the lion is singing. And as he sings, the land around him takes shape and takes definition and takes beauty. And that lion, who later names himself Aslan, declares the land to be Narnia. The way the lion sings and Narnia comes to life is the way God orchestrates the authorities and the governments in all of history. He sings, and they become. God's sovereignty. We must understand that. And that is what Paul is calling us to. This is not new. Paul is not introducing this idea of God's sovereignty here, especially when it comes to governing and authorities. Proverbs 8 says, it is by me that kings reign and rulers enact just law. By me princes lead, as do nobles and all righteous judges. Daniel, he says, this is so that the living will know that the Most High is the ruler over human kingdoms. And then I love when Jesus looks at Pilate in this backroom interrogation of John 19, and Jesus says to him, he says, you would have no authority over me at all if I hadn't given it to you from above. God's sovereignty over the rulers and over governing authorities is not new to the church at Rome. I'd actually argue it's going back to the garden when God gives Adam dominion over the garden. He gives him that authority to care for it, to tend to it. He gives him responsibility over it. And that dominion doesn't dissolve and go away at the implementation of sin, at the fall of man. We don't see it. It gets reshaped, and what we see is it rolls into the family. The dominion of the garden gets rolled into dominion of family. And as families grow and more people grow, we see in Genesis 12, well, God actually pulls Abraham aside and says, I will make you a great nation. And those who bless you, I will bless. And those who curse you, I will curse. There's a governance, there's authority in that idea. And then from that, we see an entire nation grow. And that nation walks in and out of God's will, in and out of His pleasure. They lean on their own understanding. They move to God's understanding, in and out of that. And we see God's delight and God's judgment pass from moment to moment and from people to people and from leader to leader. And we see judges roll through and we see kings roll through and we have prophets in the middle of all that. And then we get to the masterpiece that is Jesus, who brings God's kingdom to earth. God puts on flesh and brings His kingdom among us, and satisfies the law of that old kingdom so that we can be fully right with the one who created us and live under that same dominion that He intended in the garden. We can live as close to that as we can. That is what Paul is calling us to in Romans 13:1. It is a call to worship God because of His sovereignty. And that's the crux of this entire passage. Paul is calling us to worship God. So I'm going to reread verse 1. But don't let your eye be drawn to the surrender to authority. Let your heart be drawn to the call of worship to God's sovereignty. I'm going to reread it and listen now with your heart of God's sovereignty. Let everyone submit to governing authority, since there is no authority except from God. And the authorities that exist are instituted by God. Now we get to talk about God's sovereignty. And it's a beautiful thing. Paul continues in verse 2. So then, the one who resists the authority is opposing God's command, and those who oppose it will bring judgment on themselves. So Paul says here, I know there are some among you who are predisposed, who are rewired and inclined to resist and oppose. I know there are rule breakers in the room. There's an argument Paul might have been one of them, right? Like, well, if you read Paul's story, we see a lot of that. And somehow this resistance that he's talking about, there's some equivalency, there's some call to sin. He refers that when we oppose, we're bringing ourselves to judgment. So Paul equates this resistance to sin in some way. So what is God saying? We just like subjugate ourselves to all authorities, no questions asked. We just walk as robots down conveyor belts. Yes, yes, yes. And that every human in all of history across the globe is supposed to just fall in line with the governance that God puts in line. We can read the Bible. We can read a couple verses ago and realize that's not true. That there's some level that God allows. Not just Paul here. God is allowing resistance or even disagreement. And if we look at that definition of where it says the one who resists, the word there is actually hostile rebellion. A hostile rebellion. He says, don't be the one who rebels with hostility towards those authorities. Don't be that one. Resist that temptation. So for Paul, there's this line somewhere between disagreement and hostility. And he's going to clarify that in a couple more verses. So I'm going to leave it a little blurry for now. But again, this is something that's happened throughout Scripture. This isn't the first time Paul is calling, that God is calling His people to this place. Go to Judges chapter 2, we see Rahab she hid the Jewish spies from the local governor. So they haven't come through here. When in reality they're on the top, they're on the roof hiding under bushes. And she says, I'm doing this because I know your God is the all-powerful God. I know Yahweh is greater. So she resists the local authorities. And God blesses her for it, blesses the whole family. Go to the book of Daniel. It's full of these. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In our house, we call them Rack, Shack, and Benny. We got that from VeggieTales. You Gen Xers, yay. But in Daniel chapter 3, they were called to bow before the idol, and they said, nope, not doing it. They were thrown in a fiery pit. Guess what happened? They survived. Daniel, just a couple of chapters later, called to pray only to the God, only to the king. He said, nope, not doing it. So what did they do? They threw him in a den full of lions. Guess what happened? He survived. John and Peter, throughout the book of Acts, preaching a gospel against a Jewish culture in the middle of Rome. In the middle of a Roman-governed city. And they were brought in and they were told to stop preaching. And they said, nope, not going to do it. So they kicked them back out on the street. And guess what they did? They kept preaching it. And they got arrested again. And they said, stop. And they said, no. So they released it. It doesn't make any sense. Like at some point, just put them in prison. Oh, they did that. And they were singing and worshiping. And the angels came and released them. Remember? So there is this room, this space where we as God's people get to resist the authority that God has put in place under his sovereignty. And there's this line somewhere that differentiates between the two. We see this continue to play out even in the fact that America exists is this very practice. It was a rebellion against a government. So even as we look at American politics under this, which we have to think of all politics, both in today's world and in all of history as we consider this passage, but we can also think about the one we live in. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is probably one of my favorites in this. Bonhoeffer, a theologian, a pastor in Germany, in the middle, at the front end of the Nazi regime coming into power. He was vocally opposed to it, both from the pulpit and in the streets, and in his seminary classes, and in his writings. Loudly opposed, but never really did anything of great hostility. But there was this moment in his heart, and he explains it to be a very tense and still mostly unclear. He didn't have this he just felt this was the right thing to do. Him and a group did attempt an assassination on Hitler, and it failed. But he did cross what we would argue may cross that line into hostility. Was it sinful? I don't know. It's not my judgment to make. And they brought him in because of what he was saying. They imprisoned Bonhoeffer for what he was saying. As soon as they found out he was a part of this attempted assassination, they executed him. And the group that he had been imprisoned with 3 weeks after his execution was released. 3 weeks after his execution. So Bonhoeffer was vocally opposed, vehemently disagreed with the government of his day, and even went to a point of assassination, attempted assassination. And he lived in that tension. And even he said it's a tension that I don't know about. Civil rights movement in America in the 60s, the peaceful protest of Selma, the bus protest, there's a pushback against it. We see this over and over and over in both American history, global history. It's nothing new. But this call to subjugation, this idea that we're just supposed to do what the government says, that's not necessarily what Paul is calling us to. What he's calling us to, and I think this is what is probably vital here, is that line, if we have to define that line between what's allowed and what is sinful, what's sinful resistance. I think what we see is that for Paul, there's a difference of I'm defending the character of God against a governing authority that is defaming the character of God. I think Paul says where we see a government be unjust, we are allowed to step in and preach a gospel of justice. Where a government steps in and oppresses a people with chaos and pain, we get to step in with the gospel of Jesus and bring peace and bring gentleness. We get to step in and under the authority of God's sovereignty and speak to God's character. Wherever that line is, I think it exists somewhere in that place where we are bringing God's character back into the conversation. Does that make sense? It's a blurry line. It's not this hard line, and sometimes it even feels like from leader to leader that line gets erased and moved over one way or the other. But I think that's where we land. Even right before Romans 12:21, the last verse you looked at last week, argues the same thing. It says, "Don't be conquered by evil, but overcome evil with good." With good. What is good? Only God is good. Bring God into this place. 3 and 4. We'll speed up, sorry. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you want to be unafraid of the one in authority? Do what is good, and you will have its approval. For it is God's servant for your good. But if you do what is wrong, be afraid, because it does not carry a sword for no reason. For it is God's servant, an avenger that brings wrath to the one who does wrong. So here Paul actually begins to give some boundaries to what these governing authorities are allowed and supposed to do. And the first, he kind of sets a maximum and a minimum, or he sets kind of road signs or road guardrails on both sides. He says, first, they need to approve the things that are good. The governing authorities ought to be identifying like exemplar situations, exemplar people, exemplar communities among the larger community, and bringing them out front and saying, this is the good among us. They ought to be platforming the virtuous acts that the people are doing, that the people that they oversee, the people they govern. What is the virtuous among them? Platform that. Where are we seeing this great character that we want our people, this community, this ethos to be known for? We should platform that character. We should reward that character and let everyone see that reward go around. It says they approve what is good, and then they also avenge those who do wrong. Right? I think the Avengers movies, I modeled this perfectly. As a group of people, bad comes to oppress innocent, and a group of people with superpowers or robots, whatever, come in and they take that out. There's a great cost to it, yes, but that's what they do. But what Paul is saying, the government is to bring justice. They should give justice among their people. Not just talk about it, not just threaten justice, but bring justice. They should move into a presence among the people and bring justice as they go. And when terror comes in, the government should step in and remove that terror. They should remove it and then build some level of protection around the people that terror is oppressing. So when it says avenge those who are doing wrong, that's what Paul is calling the government to do under the sovereignty of God. So he gives us some definitions. This is what government is about. And again, do our struggles with governments, do they exist because government steps outside that? Or maybe we don't like how they do that? Or maybe we disagree what they're saying is good and virtuous. We don't think it is, and we want to speak against it. Or maybe we think the people they're calling bad are actually doing something good. We don't agree with the definition of things. I don't know. I'm just saying Paul is saying the role of government is to appeal to what is good, approve it, and to bring justice to the evil. Verse 5. Therefore, you must submit. Therefore, you must submit, not only because of the wrath, but also because of your conscience. So in verse 3 and 4, he says there's a wrath because they carry the sword. And we should be aware of that. But in verse 5, he introduces a new level of motivation. He introduces the conscience. And when we define conscience, this is a really big conversation. So we're going to try to unpack 3 or 4 weeks of philosophy class into a sentence. Essentially, it's this human faculty that exists within us to distinguish between what is right and what is wrong. And that the standard of that, it really is what we understand as the greatest model. What is that archetype of right and wrong? And that's how our conscience decides what is right and wrong. We have a set standard inside of us, an understanding. And our conscience lives within the light of what we understand that standard to be. So Paul is he's shifting from this fear and authoritarian motivation, which is real. He's not discrediting it, but he's saying there's that, and then there's also this personal internal accountability that you have as well. And if we read Paul just for a little bit, we actually see that this Paul working from a clean conscience or a clear conscience is really important to him. In his letter to Timothy, 1 Timothy 1, in the first verses, verse 5, like the introductory part, he actually says, Timothy, the goal of our instruction is love. The reason we teach, the reason we lead, the reason we sacrifice is love. Both God's love for us that he shared with us and our love for the people we serve and live with. And then he tells them how to do that. Goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart, a clean conscience, and a sincere faith. Paul is saying there's something about this clean conscience that is vital to the Christian life. He even says in Acts chapter 16, he says, I do all I can to have a clean conscience before man and before God. To have a clean conscience before man and before God. So if I had to somehow summarize it in a brief explanation, it'd be, there's this idea in Paul that he says all of us have, that we know, understanding right and wrong. Are we living in right or in wrong with our relationship with God? And when we live in right with him, we understand it's his mercy that brought us to that place, and we worship him because of it. And when we've wronged God, we live in a pattern, a rhythm that we come and confess and we repent and we receive God's grace and mercy. And in the same way living right brings mercy, the same way living wrong and confession brings mercy, and both lead us to worshiping him. Clean conscience means we're living right with God. And then also with man, so that when we've wronged man, we're pursuing reconciliation. When we know we've wronged our neighbor, we pursue reconciliation. So Paul is saying, yes, there's the fear of wrath, but there's also this clean conscience that we want to live with. And we can't let the governing authorities and our thoughts of them affect that conscience. So live with them, honor them, live in submission to them for the sake of your conscience. Paul somehow sees that there's a threat to conscience when we are unwilling to surrender. An unwillingness to surrender is somehow a threat to our ability to live right with God and man. And the hard part is all of us have that different conscience in us. Jesus is the standard of all of it, and we're looking to him to understand what is right and wrong and how we live our lives. But sometimes how we get there is different, and so we all live it a little differently. And some people have been taught an unbiblical view of Jesus, and so their understanding of right and wrong is coming from something that has nothing to do with the real Jesus. And that's a lot of the difficulty we face. It's a lot of difficulty our brothers and sisters throughout history have faced when it comes to the governments around them. I think Paul wants us to not forget our opinions of our governments should not force us to overlook our neighbor. If we start looking too high up the chain, we will look right past our neighbor and forget them. Paul does not want that to happen. All right, verse 6 and 7. Y'all did it too. The first verse did not respond. It was awesome. Whenever my kids, if I say those numbers in front of my kids, the house is gone for 3 hours. It's crazy. Y'all didn't. Thank you. I appreciate it. 6 and 7. And for this reason you pay taxes, since the authorities are God's servants, continually attending to these tasks. Pay your obligations to everyone, taxes to those you owe taxes, tolls to those you owe tolls, respect to those you owe respect, and honor to those you owe honor. Those first words, this reason here, this reason is for that clear conscience. So we can have a clear conscience, pay taxes. And sometimes he gives you kind of two obligations. There's taxes and tolls, and there's respect and honor. And when I first sat down with this, I was like, that's two kind of subsets of obligations. Like there's tolls and taxes. Here's my tolls, build roads. Here's my taxes, build an army and protect. Here's my respect and honor. And this is this love and this emotion I feel for neighbor, for people, for for the same things that are being like platformed. I have respect and honor. And I kind of viewed it as there's this transactional, tolls and taxes, and then there's the relational, honor and respect. But as you dig, what I began to see is all four are actually transactional. Honor and respect are transactional as well. Yes, they're emotive. Yes, we feel something behind them, but they're still transactional. because I only give respect to people who do respectful things. I only give honor to people who do honorable things. So they are not different. So whenever Paul is saying honor those who do honorable things, it's our response to those who are leading well, who are caring well, at any level of authority, from the smallest to the highest. Anyone who is doing and giving respect and honorable things, we should give them what they've earned. Don't neglect that. Don't just think I get to love a certain people and I get to move on. No, we need to point out those who are acting and leading and governing in respectful and honorable ways. They deserve it. In verse 8, the summation of this, and to me, after the sovereignty, the highlight that brings it all together, Paul lands, he says, do not owe anyone anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. Paul is saying, don't live a life that withholds what God has already given to you. Out of his sovereignty, he has given you forgiveness and mercy. You should be a people who forgive and are merciful. Out of God's sovereignty, he has given you patience and gentleness. We should be a people who are known as patient and gentle. Out of God's sovereignty, he's given us kindness and peace. We should be a people who are known as kind and peaceful. That is how we should live, no matter what the governing authorities are. And loving others is how we get to see Jesus. Because we have dwelt in him, we have enjoyed him, we have known his love for us, and we get to pass on that love for others. Jesus is the one who we are giving our entire lives to. Sometimes you'll read this passage and you're like, how much do I give to government? How much do I give to the burdens and convictions I have? The answer to that question is none to both. You don't give any of yourself to government. You don't give any of yourself to conviction. You give all of yourself to Jesus and Jesus alone. That is the archetype of what we're looking at here. So if I have to summarize the people of Jesus, first, we live in a primary allegiance to the sovereignty of God. And we do that by living with a clean conscience. We live right with God and right with neighbor. And how do we do that? We give away everything God's given us. Karl Barth, pastor, theologian in the Rise, also like Bonhoeffer, about similar times as Bonhoeffer. He wrote a letter to some French believers who early on in the Nazi regime had been vocal opposition against them. But as the Nazi army had moved into France, they had begun to kind of quiet and mute themselves. And Barth wrote this: are you quieting because Hitler is advancing? If you are changing your viewpoint on the basis of losing or winning, it means Hitler has not only conquered your country, he has conquered your souls. The people of God, it does not matter to us if our country is conquered or if our country is conquering. What matters to us is that our souls in the presence of God and God alone. Is that where we are sitting? Is that where our worship lies? Is that where our delight and our joy is in God and God alone, and we trust his sovereignty even when it makes no sense to us. We find peace in that tension of not fully understanding because of the cross. Because the cross is empty, so is the tomb. We have a resurrected Messiah that has overcome all sin. He has overcome all death. And we can live in the space that says, I worship Jesus and I trust him in all things.